Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the thumbs up. I appreciate that. Helps to know that you guys can hear me and that everything is working properly. This webinar is being recorded, and this is the June office hours. And our presentation this morning is Common Issues of Non-Compliance. The questions box is going to be moderated by Amy Hammond. She's joining me today. This presentation should run until about 10:30, at which time we will shift gears into the open forum office hours. Hopefully you'll stay with us throughout the webinar, but if you do want to jump off and come back for the open forum, you're welcome to do so. That usually begins about 10:30. So without any further delay, we will begin. We've got our comment. Oh, and my name is Cara Poli for those of you that do not know me. I always forget to introduce myself. I apologize. So the webinar today is Common Issues of Non-Compliance. And what we're going to talk about today is kind of what the biggies are that we see, some of the reasons they happen, some of the common ways to correct, and then allow you guys to ask questions about each topic. If we are not able to get to every single non-compliance issue that's listed in the PowerPoint and the outline that you were provided, you do have those accessible and you can reach out with questions after the fact. I did try to set this one up in a way that would be a usable resource, even if we did not get to them in the discussion part of today's webinar. You should have received an email if you registered prior to 8 a.m. this morning. You should have gotten an email from me with the handout and the outline provided. If you did not, or you didn't save those, or you want to get them through the GoToMeeting platform, up in the top right-hand corner, you should have a little paper-looking icon that has a paper clip, and that's going to have the handouts attached to it. Couple of housekeeping slides that we always do. We've got our mailing address there. If you ever need to send us anything, please send it to the P.O. box. If you have a need to come by and see where the magic happens, that's at that East 11th Street address. We are across the street from the Capitol, so if you're down here to see the state Capitol, that would be a good time to wave at our building and say that you've seen it, so you can cross that off your bucket list. Our website there is tdhca.texas.gov. Amy has put that in the chat as well. If you have a general email or you have a tenant who needs to reach out to somebody and they're not sure who they need to reach out to and you don't want to necessarily give them a compliance monitor email, you can use that info at tdhca.texas.gov. That goes to a general mailbox, and then those are forwarded out to the appropriate division. Our division's phone number is the 305-8869 that you see there on your screen. You may be asked to leave a voicemail there if somebody is not able to get to your call immediately. That will then be forwarded to a monitor, and we will respond as timely as we can. There is also a 1-800 number for in-Texas toll-free calls. As I said a minute ago, this is going to run from 9 a.m. till 11:30. We usually have about an hour and a half of the webinar portion, and then we have an open forum for about an hour. The open forum is not recorded, and there is no formal presentation. We will take a break so that I can shift gears between the formal presentation and the open forum. So there will be about a 5-minute window there to do that. Amy and I will stay on to answer questions during this morning portion, and then at about 10:30 we will have some other folks from the department join us and help answer questions in the general forum. Certificates will not be provided for this webinar. You should get an email that says thank you for attending, and that would be the proof if you needed to provide something to your ownership management compliance division or just wanted to be able to show that this is where you spent your morning. Those might go to your junk email. Unfortunately, I cannot resend those. So if you need that email for any reason, please keep an eye out in your main email box, your spam, your junk, whatever you've got going on, so that you can use that if you need it. I would encourage you to silence your phones and put an out of office. This is a 2.5-hour window, and we would love for you to get the most out of it and avoid distractions during the training. Please pose any questions and comments into the questions box. We do not have any polls in today's training, but Amy will put resources as are applicable in the chat. She has already put quite a few in there. And this is a less resourceful training, but lots of good information. So some resources, as we always do, and you can copy and paste these from the outline that was provided as well. We have our main compliance page, and then we have our manuals and rules on that page. Our forms are on that page. Compliance reporting is on that page. The utility allowance information is available on that page. The link to the income and rent limits are on that page. The compliance training website is there, and that is where all the presentations are linked. This one is being recorded, and it will be posted there. It usually takes me a couple days to a week, kind of depending on the staff that I need assistance from to get that posted. So look for that between now and next Friday. There will be an announcement that goes out that lets you know it's posted. We have a list of frequently asked questions under a couple different topics there at that FAQ link. And then we have our compliance division staff. If you're not sure who you need to talk to, or if you can't remember how to spell my last name or which Kara you need to talk to, that's a good list to use as a resource in the event that you need to reach out to a monitor. In this training, we will talk about some common issues of noncompliance, but we will not talk about every issue of noncompliance. We will talk about some of what causes these issues and some common ways to correct the noncompliance. We will talk about resources that can be used to remain in compliance. We will not discuss specific properties and monitoring reviews. We will not discuss programs that are not monitored by the department, and we will not change the required corrective action for an existing monitoring review. If you have questions about an existing monitoring review or corrective action process, please email the monitor that handled the review or is handling the corrective action review or the physical inspection. The first kind of granddaddy of noncompliance issues is our ineligible households. The issue of noncompliance, technically speaking, is program unit not leased to low-income household income above the income limit upon initial occupancy. So this is going to be for if you moved in a household that was not eligible, or if the monitor is unable to determine if the household was eligible. So maybe your file's missing something, that sort of a thing. This is reportable on the 8823 audit guide for housing tax credit developments if you are in the federal compliance period. This is addressed in the 8823 audit guide, chapter 4, and we discuss this in the Texas Administrative Code, chapter 10, subchapter F, 10.611, if you wanted a little more information. Some common causes of this issue of noncompliance that would not allow the department to determine eligibility or would determine ineligibility of a household at move-in would be maybe the income just calculated over the highest limit. Income wasn't verified or included. Assets were not verified or included. Income certifications are not signed by the household. Additional household members not properly added. Live-in aides or foster persons not properly verified. Applicable fraction violations. Household being moved from one project to another without certification, or using the Section 8 verification improperly. So we're going to talk through each of these since this is kind of the biggie. So for calculation errors, the common cause is that a rate of pay was not taken into account. It was just miscalculated. Maybe you used 24 pay periods when you should have used 26. Or something, or you used 26 when it should have been 52, that sort of a thing. This can also be caused by child support not being calculated correctly. Please remember that with HOTMA, we do use the 120-day window for child support now and what they're actually receiving, not the court-ordered amount. We do have some different income trainings where we discuss that in detail. So you can see here a couple examples of the citation of noncompliance. The first one, department calculated the household's income using the employment verification. Household income at move-in equals $26,910, which exceeded the 2024 income limit of $22,650 for a one-person household. Or department calculated the household's income using the pay frequency indicated on the pay stubs of 26 pay periods. Total household income at move-in equals $54,166.58, which exceeds the 2024 income limit of $52,920 for a one-person household. So you can see there that sometimes it's just a simple math error. Maybe the property forgot to implement new limits. Maybe they thought that a higher limit was applicable. Number of reasons this could have happened, but this is something that would be important to keep those calculation pages in your tenant file so that we can see what you did. Sometimes that helps us to make sure that we're not making an error and to better explain the issue of noncompliance when we do cite it in the monitoring report. The next one is that maybe income or assets was not verified or included as verified in the eligibility calculation. If your pay stubs are older than 120 days, if the employment or income disclosed on the application is not verified, if the assets are over the applicable HUD threshold, which is currently $51,600, they must be evaluated for inclusion, and imputed income may need to be included. Actual income from assets is always included. So if that was an error, that can cause an issue of noncompliance, especially in some of your areas where the households are very close to the limit. So a couple ways this might be cited. The monitor is unable to establish eligibility. The application submitted indicated employment income. The file contained an unemployment affidavit, and no other explanation was in the file. The monitor was unable to determine the household's eligibility at the time of move-in. The tenant file contained pay stubs which were more than 120 days from the date of the initial certification. The monitor was unable to establish eligibility. The application submitted by the applicant indicated owned real estate. The file contained an asset certification indicating only a checking account was held. No other explanation was in the file. So those are three reasons that this might be cited. And some of those have an easier fix than others, but they should be really well explained in the monitoring report specific. But this is some language from some existing monitoring reports that have gone out with this issue of noncompliance. The next reason you might be cited with an ineligible household issue of noncompliance is that the income certification was not signed. And I know you all just giggled and thought, well, that's dumb. We've done this forever, and income certifications always get signed. I can tell you that every trip I take, and I travel once a month, there is always one unsigned income certification between all the properties that I review. I have this at least once. So it is something that gets missed, even by pros. And it should be addressed. So you want to be sure that your on-site staff is well trained to help avoid this. But if it does get missed, it'll be cited that the household occupied the unit on February 10th, 2025, or whatever their move-in date was, without executing an income certification. Your corrective action is going to be to present and have the household execute the income certification from the time of initial occupancy. Do not backdate. Submit the executed income certification to the department for review. This would be cited if the file contained all the applicable and acceptable verifications to document what was on that income certification. If it didn't, this would not be the issue that was cited. It would be one of the ones we've just discussed. The next reason this might come up is when a household member is added, they have to be fully verified as a new applicant, and then they have to be added to the most recent certification for the household. So if we review a file, we've got a couple examples here. The file contained information that a new member has been added to the household, but the file did not contain the verifications or updated income certification to properly reflect the addition. You would be asked then to submit documentation supporting eligibility of the new household member as of whatever date they were added to the household. Present and have the new household member execute the income certification form at the time of their initial occupancy. Another reason this might be cited is that the file contained an application and verifications for a new household member. However, the new household member was not added to the most recent certification. Please present and have the new household member execute the income certification from the time of their initial occupancy. Do not backdate. Submit the executed income certification to the department for review. So if they added to the household, but maybe they added during a recertification and they signed the initial certification, but not the most recent full income certification when they were added, that would be the issue there. You would want to have them sign the most recent income certification. If you do AECs at your property, that's going to be the initial certification because you don't do a TIC every year or a tenant income certification. Another one might be live-in aids or foster persons not properly verified. A live-in aid has to meet the requirements and then income is excluded. Foster persons that are placed with a court order are excluded in the calculation of eligibility and household sizes for eligibility purposes. So if the household occupied the unit on March 10th, the application indicates that one of the household members is a live-in aid. However, the need for an aid was not present in the tenant file. That would be an issue of noncompliance. Might be able to be dropped if the live-in aid verification, maybe it's available and it got filed in the wrong file, or you can get it to go, back from the time of move-in to show that no, they did need the live-in aid, that sort of a thing. Or the household contains 4 persons, the head of household, their spouse, and 2 foster children. The annual income for the household is $73,250, which is over the applicable limit for a 2-person household. Foster persons are not considered as household members for persons of eligibility. So this is an issue that pre-HOTMA would not have been an issue of noncompliance, but will be after HOTMA was implemented, which the department began monitoring for January 1st, 2024. The next cause of this noncompliance is going to be applicable fraction violations. Maybe there's too many market units in a building, or the fraction is based on square footage and the property used the unit size or unit calculation to determine the fraction. So it's important to know how that fraction was determined. So that might be cited as the applicable fraction for building 1 should be 96.3% based on the unit count. The building is currently being leased at 94.44% based on the unit count. Unit 102 moved in as a market on October 16th, so that's the issue of noncompliance date, and you would want to make sure that you reset that applicable fraction. So the noncompliance will be corrected once the applicable fraction of the building is restored. The next reason you might have an ineligible household is that a household moved from one project to another without certifying. Sometimes folks don't realize that their buildings aren't one big project. This is why it's important for owners and management companies to be sure that your on-site folks are aware of the project configuration for your tax credit and the like. Properties, other property or other programs do not have the same transfer requirements. So if you have a home development, they don't have to recertify to transfer. So this specific issue is going to be a tax credit, TCAP, exchange type noncompliance. When a household moves from one project to another, they must be qualified as an eligible household. Project elections are made on Forms 8609, line 8B. So an example of this is the household in Unit 123 appears to have originally occupied Unit 789 in Building 3 on March 1st. In 2023, the household then moved to a new unit October 1st, 2024, without being properly certified as an eligible household. The owner elected to treat each building as an individual project for purposes of the housing tax credit program. So that would mean that you would have to certify that household and do it as either at current circumstances, or if they were able to obtain the stuff from when they transferred, that would be another way that you could do that as well. So for Section 8 verification being used improperly, the effective date of the most recent certification date on the Section 8 verification has to be within 120 days of the certification of the household. So we've got an example here. The household in Unit 1011 occupied the unit March 1st, 2025. The household was qualified using a Section 8 verification with a date of March 1st, 2024. The effective date of the verification is more than 120 days prior to the certification effective date. The corrective action would be to verify the income and assets from the time of move-in and update the income certification if required. Submit the income and asset verification and the updated income certification for department review. If unable to verify income and assets from the time of move-in, the household may be qualified under current circumstances, which would reset their recertification requirements as far as what date you would perform that on. Some other corrective action examples are when the unit becomes available, lease it to a qualifying household. Submit copies of the new household's application, verifications of income and assets, executed income certification form, first and signatory page of the lease contract, applicable lease addenda, including the executed acknowledgement page of the Tenant Rights and Resources Guide. If the household circumstances have changed since move-in, a new certification may be performed using current circumstances and current income and asset information. If a new certification is performed for an existing household, submit the new application verification of income and asset, verification of student status, and new executed income certification documentation to the department for review. Verify the income and asset from the time of move-in and update the income certification if needed. Submit the income asset verification and the updated income certification for department review. If unable to do so, you would qualify them under current circumstances. So those are 3 scenarios that would be used. So if you have a household that you identify before we come out for a monitoring review and you think, oh, this is an ineligible household, I need to fix this, here's a couple of ideas on how to do that. And if it's before we come out for a review, it may not be cited as non-compliance when we come out for a review because you've already identified it and corrected it before we notified you of the review. Amy, are there any questions on ineligible household issues of non-compliance?
Nope.
All right. Then we are going to talk about utility allowances next. If you do have issues, feel free to put those in the questions box. Utility allowances are kind of the second one, and there's a variety of reasons that you might have utility allowance noncompliance. This is written up in the monitoring report as noncompliance with utility allowance requirements described in 10.614 of this subchapter, meaning the TINTAC subchapter F, and or Treasury Regulation 1.42-10, commonly called -10 regs. This is reportable on Forms 8823 to the IRS, sometimes in the Housing Tax Credit Program. It is addressed in the 8823 Audit Guide, Chapter 18, and it is addressed in the TINTAC in Chapter 10.614. So if I reference utility allowance rules, that's what I'm referencing. If I reference -10, I'm talking about Treasury Regulation 1.42-10. And if you want to read that, you can put in your search engine of choice, Treasury Regulation 1.42-10, and it will pull it up. Or you can go to our utility allowance section of our website, and you can click the information down at the bottom. We have that linked there. Some common causes of this issue of noncompliance are not implementing timely, meaning the unit status report was not updated, not including a flat fee, using the wrong public housing authority, having a HUD-regulated building and using the PHA method when you were not allowed to do so, or failing to submit for the annual review. Not implementing timely means that the unit status report was not updated with the current UA on the effective date. So a reason this might be cited is the current utility allowance was issued September 30th, 2024 for rents due after December 30th, 2024. The unit status report submitted for the monitoring review does not indicate that the development has implemented the utility allowance as required. Implement the utility allowance and update the USR reflecting the implementation to change and any change in rents. Submit a dated cover letter stating that the utility allowance has been updated on the unit status report. The department will pull the current USR from the CMTS system to determine compliance. We will then test the rents on that USR. So it is important that you go through unit by unit to make sure that rents are properly restricted using the new utility allowance. Any additional non-compliance, so if there are rent issues from that test, they will then be cited under separate cover. You would have a new 90-day corrective action period specific to that additional non-compliance, and it would not be cited on that. It would not have to fall under that original 90 days. It would start a new corrective action period. So the next one is that a flat fee is not included. Sometimes PHA schedules include flat fees for electric and or gas services. If these are not included in the calculated UA, then the UA is not properly calculated. You can see here one reason that might be cited or one way that might be worded. The residents are responsible for electric at the development, and the Public Housing Authority published a utility allowance that includes a flat fee for electric. The development did not include this flat fee in the calculation of the utility allowance. Kind of the same corrective action as the one before. Implement the correct utility allowance, including the flat fee, and update the USR to reflect the implementation and any change in rents. Submit a dated cover letter. We're going to pull a live unit status report, and the non-compliance would be considered corrected when the USR is updated and any additional non-compliance triggered by the failure to implement is addressed. The next cause of the utility allowance non-compliance might be that the wrong housing authority was used. If you are in a city with a public housing authority, then the applicable PHA is the city PHA. The county cannot be used unless the property is in the county, but not in a municipality where the existing PHA is with a Section 8 program. So for example, the development lies in the city of San Antonio within Bexar County. However, the San Antonio Housing Authority's PHA schedule does not appear to be the PHA schedule used for the utility allowance. The development submitted the Bexar County PHA schedule, and the unit status report reflects those amounts. So the corrective action is going to be that you need to obtain the current UA schedule from San Antonio's Housing Authority, implement by updating the unit status report, submit to us a dated cover letter that says, hey, we updated this, we implemented the USR. We at the department are then going to test that utility allowance with the rents. And with this example, we probably used the San Antonio UA when we did the monitoring. So we may have already identified what issues there might be with gross rent with regards to the utility allowance issue. But the unit status report would still need to be updated, and then any additional non-compliance would be addressed under separate cover. The next issue would be that if the building is HUD regulated and the HUD funding is used then to determine the utility allowance for the building. If the property does not have HUD funds but does have multifamily direct loan funds from the department or from another entity, then the UA is going to be for the HUD regulated buildings. Not using the correct UA will cause non-compliance. So an example of this is the utility allowance is calculated on a building by building basis, and as every building at the development contains at least one public housing unit, the buildings at the property are all considered HUD regulated, and the only allowable utility allowance for all rent restricted units is the method prescribed under the relevant home program. So if you've got home in your buildings and you used a different allowance for your buildings that weren't on the, or for your units that weren't on the home program, that would be what this is talking about. The corrective action would be to obtain the most current utility allowance from whatever entity holds that HUD regulated UA status, implement the correct utility allowance, and update the unit status report to reflect the updated tenant paid rent, utility allowance, and rental assistance for each unit. Submit a dated cover letter and the most current utility allowance to the department for review. Once the corrected utility allowance is in place, the department will review the rent for each household to ensure that the occupancy requirements prescribed under the LURA are met. That's saying we're going to make sure you have the right number of 30, 50, 60s, 40s, if your average income, that everything maths out. Based on that review, additional non-compliance may be cited under separate cover and again would have a new 90-day corrective action period. The next reason this might be cited is that owners must update the annual allowance once a calendar year. The update and all backup documentation required by the method must be submitted to the department no later than October 1st of each year. So a reason this might be cited is during the review, the department noted that the owner had not requested an annual review of the development's utility allowance on October 1st as required. So if I come out to monitor you now, it's June. That should have been done in October of 2024. If you did not do that and you used one of those methods that requires annual review, this is going to be cited in the monitoring report. The corrective action would be that if the owner wishes to continue to use the method, submit the required documentation for annual review. The owner may also elect a different methodology under 10.614. Prior to changing methodologies, the department has to approve. Once a properly calculated utility allowance is in effect, the department will review the gross rents for each unit, and you should submit a dated cover letter for this as well so that we know kind of what your intentions are on that And in most cases, we probably would have used the applicable PHA if there was one to conduct the monitoring review. So at this point, by not submitting annually and having a monitoring review, you're telling us that you've defaulted to the PHA method. That's what we monitored with. So that's what your method is at that point. And now you would need to submit for review if you wanted to switch back to the energy consumption model or HUD model or written local estimate or actual use method. Some general notes on utility allowances, except for MFDL developments like home and National Housing Trust Fund NSP. If an owner fails to submit for annual review during the calendar year, the development's utility allowance will default to the applicable PHA allowance. If the development is in an area that does not have a PHA, the development fails to have a properly calculated utility allowance. The owner may elect a different methodology found in 10.614, but prior to changing the methodology or changing what tenants are responsible for, you have to notify the department, and then we would issue an approval or a denial based on programming at the development. You cannot make any changes until lease contracts are up if you're changing what the tenants are responsible for, or until you have received an approval from us to change methodologies. Do we have any utility allowance questions?
Yes, we have one.
Okay, I was starting to think the questions box was broken.
How long do we have to implement a PHA utility allowance once the effective date has changed? Is it 30 days?
So a PHA schedule is going to have an effective date, or it should have an effective date on the schedule. If it doesn't, you'd want to find out from the PHA what the effective date is. You can implement that immediately. So for rents due 30 days after that effective date, but it must be implemented within 90 days. So if the housing authority puts out a schedule with an effective date of January 1st, 2025, that should have been in place for rents due April 1st, 2025. So if I came out to monitor you in April, May, or now, and you're still using the 2024 schedule, that's going to be cited as a utility allowance issue of noncompliance. Any gross rent issues or additional state rent and occupancy issues that follow that from me testing and using the 2025 schedule in my monitoring review would be cited as either gross rent or additional rent and occupancy, depending on kind of how that shakes out for the review. Anything else?
No.
Okay. So the next topic of noncompliance are Inspire inspections. I'm going to go through this. Manuel will be here with us. The manager of physical inspections will be here with us starting at 10:30. So if you have specific questions that we are unable to answer about Inspire, we will hold until that 10:30 open forum. So you'll want to stay with us for at least that time period, and we'll try to get those answered first.
Kara, we did have another utility allowance question that came in, and it is a very common one, and it's a good one. If the property has Section 8 and public housing units, which utility allowance is used? I'm saying you are HUD regulated, so you go ask HUD.
I would agree, unless you have our home funds, and if you have Section 8 housing choice vouchers and public housing, then you're going to use our home UA.
Yeah.
But otherwise, you would probably want to reach out to HUD. Yes, I think that would be the best course of action. So for Inspire inspections, the way this is generally cited is violation of the national standards for the physical inspection of real estate, Inspire inspection. This is reportable on Form 8823 to the IRS during the federal compliance period for housing tax credit developments. This is all explained in the audit guide, 8823 audit guide, chapter 6, and our Texas Administrative Code subchapter F has a section dedicated to this, and it is 10.621. Some common issues, this is kind of an umbrella issue of noncompliance, kind of like the ineligible household noncompliance issue, where there's a lot of different reasons it might be cited. And these are some of the more common ones: inoperable smoke detectors, missing, damaged, or expired fire extinguishers, exposed wires or open panels, unprotected outlet is present within 6 feet of a water source, exposed electrical conductors, infestation like roaches, AFCI outlet or AFCA breaker is not visibly damaged, and the test or reset button is inoperable. There's a scoring scale with regards to Inspire inspections. We are still using the 0 to 100 scoring scale for multifamily properties inspected using Inspire. Developments scoring a 70 or below are deemed to be in poor physical condition and subject to an accelerated inspection schedule until the score improves. The responsible party may be referred to the department's enforcement committee for possible debarment if on more than one occasion the property scores 50 or less on an Inspire inspection. All inspection reports will include the score. Two types of corrective action are allowed based on the score. If it's 75 or higher, 3 documents will be issued for corrective action. An Excel spreadsheet will be required. You'll enter the full name of the person or entity that corrected each deficiency and the date the deficiency was corrected. You'll also complete an owner certification stating that all non-compliant or all issues have been corrected. And then you'll complete the complete Inspire inspection report with the score in PDF format will be sent with you for the inspection report or following the inspection. If the score is 75 or below, the department or the development is going to have to submit written documentation for corrections of each deficiency cited in the report, including the work orders for the exigent health and safety issues that were corrected immediately, invoices, not bids, for all deficiencies corrected by a vendor, including pest control tickets, and detailed complete maintenance requests. So you want to be sure on your work orders that you're using for those that it says replaced smoke alarm or replaced batteries and smoke alarm or repaired door or whatever the issue was. You want to be sure that it's got the details and it doesn't just have like a check mark and a date, that sort of a thing. For those that score 75 or below, the site maintenance requests must include the identified deficiency for repairs, the location of the deficiency, a detailed description of the action taken or repair made to correct the deficiency. Single words like complete, done, repaired, etc. are not usually going to be acceptable. Date the repair was completed, and signature of the person responsible for the repairs or the person who is accountable for the quality of the repair. Are there any questions on Inspire that you and I could answer?
No, there is a question, but I do not know the answer, and I doubt you do.
Nope, I probably don't.
And so, Garrett, when I'm going to leave this here, and when Manuel gets in, we will make sure I'm going to tag it
as a follow-up.
And that way I know to come back to this one.
Perfect. So the next issue of noncompliance that we see more often than we would like to are gross rent and additional rent and occupancy. And the reason these are together is because in a lot of cases, these are going to be similarly caused or cited issues of noncompliance. Gross rent is when the gross rent exceeds the highest rent allowed under the LURA or other deed restriction. If you are a housing tax credit development and you have to have 40% of your units at 60%, this is going to be how it's cited for your 60% units. If you're home and you have 50 and 80, this is going to be cited for those. If you also have 30s, that would be additional state rent and occupancy. This is reportable on Form 8823 to the IRS during the compliance period. It's outlined in the 8823 Audit Guide, Chapter 11, and in the 10 TAC under 10.622. For housing tax credit, where you have 20% of your units at 50%, the threshold is 50%. For the 40 at 60, the threshold is 60%. And in an average income deal, all of the designations are federally allowed, and so any of those would be cited as gross rent. So if you have a 20% unit that's not meeting the gross rent, that is reportable in an average income deal. Some common causes are not including mandatory fees in the gross rent calculation or charging disallowed fees, not using the correct utility allowance, or just overcharging the tenant rent. So when you don't include a mandatory fee in the gross rent calculation or you charge a disallowed fee, it would be cited under this. There's a couple of examples. During the review, it was noted that renter's insurance is required as a condition of occupancy. The cost of services that are required as a condition of occupancy must be included in the gross rent calculation. The corrective action would be to submit documentation evidencing the cost of renter's insurance for department review. The department will review the gross rent for each unit to confirm compliance. Any additional noncompliance that results from the review will be addressed under separate cover. Another reason is it states here that the owner stated applicants are charged $15 for background checks. No documentation was available during the monitoring review to support the background or application fee. You would submit to the department a monthly invoice and documentation demonstrating the total number of applications run at the development and what the fee is, so that we could determine if that was allowable or not. So there's a couple different reasons. And you're probably thinking, well, an application fee is not gross rent, but that is how it is cited, because that is kind of what that falls under, because that does affect the gross rent calculation for the household. If the incorrect utility allowance is being used, this could be that the tenant rent wasn't updated when the UA changed, or the development has not implemented the new UA or the correct UA. Couple ways this is cited. Tenant paid rent of $600 plus the utility allowance of $60 exceeds the one bedroom limit of $640. Tenant paid rent of $600 plus utility allowance of $60 plus mandatory month-to-month fee of $100 exceeds the one bedroom 60% rent limit of $640. The tenant payment of rent of $957 plus the utility allowance of $79 equals $1,036, which exceeds the two-bedroom allowable rent limit of $1,030 for the 60% area median income. You would need to calculate the overcharged rent in some cases, but we would cite that in there. However, for most of these, it is going to be corrected. If you are in the federal compliance period, you can't correct it until January 1st of the following tax year. So if we come out to your property now and we find gross rent issues, there, even if you correct them by lowering the rent and properly notifying the household, it's still going to be January 1st of 2026 before those show as corrected on Form 8823. So that's why it's incredibly important to keep an eye on those rents and make sure you're using the right utility allowance and that fees are accounted for, and that sort of a thing. If you are post 15 or a different program other than housing tax credit, you may have to refund the rent, and you're going to have to send us a calculation of the overcharged rent. You're going to have to obtain written certification from the household whether they want a credit on their account or a check, and you're going to have to send us the evidence of either of those items: a new lease, notification of the reduction of rent, and then the ledger that shows that the rent has been decreased on the following month. Any questions on gross rent?
No, not right.
Okay. So the next issue that kind of still falls under this rent umbrella is that the development failed to meet additional state required rent and occupancy restrictions. So this is that additional stuff. If you are tax credit and you're a 40 at 60, but you have 30s, 40s, 50s, this is going to fall under that. If you're home and you have 30s, that sort of a thing. The development failed to meet additional state required rent and occupancy restrictions. These are not reportable on Form 8823, and they are not addressed in the 8823 audit guide because they are state requirements. They are, however, addressed in the TINTAC subchapter F 10.615. Many developments have additional rent and income requirements, which are lower than or in addition to the federal set aside. Any additional designations will be outlined in the LURA. These can also be triggered by an incorrect UA. They can be triggered by testing, where we go through and we run a test on the submitted unit status report, and maybe there aren't enough 30% or 50% units, or they can be triggered by a unit designation change. So for the first one, if there's an incorrect UA, the development has not implemented the correct UA. Due to the failure to implement the correct utility allowance, several units do not meet the rent restrictions of 30 and 50% as indicated in Appendix A of the Land Use Restriction Agreement. You're going to have to update the utility allowance, update the rent, calculate the rent overages, and refund those amounts. If it is triggered by testing, we're going to tell you that. We're going to say that you're supposed to have, like in this example, 11 units that are at 50% AMI, or with rents at 50%. And we were only able to identify 10. So you need to find one other household that qualifies or is designated at 50% and make their rent be the correct amount to fall under that 50% limit. If it's triggered by a unit designation change, you want to be sure that you remember a household's program designation as recorded on the income certification at the time of move-in cannot be increased unless the household was found to never have income qualified for the unit, no longer income qualifies for the unit, or program rules require the change. The household in 102 was originally certified as a 30% household. The most recent certification indicated the designation has been changed to 50%. That would be an issue where this would be cited. They should have stayed at the 30% unless one of those other items was met and required that change. So some corrective action requirements would be sometimes the department will calculate the overages, and sometimes due to time constraints, we do not do that. So if we submit that to you, that would need to be reviewed, but you as the owner, management, on-site staff would still want to calculate the rent to make sure that you guys agree with the calculation that we have. You're going to have to submit an updated lease reflecting the reduced rent, notification of the household of the reduction, a copy of the tenant's election to accept a credit or a refund, ledger demonstrating reduced rent is being charged if a credit was elected, or if a check was given. We still need to see that that lower rent has been implemented. You would need to issue or send us a copy of the check if that's what is elected. If the resident has vacated and cannot be located, the excess monies must be put into a trust account for the tenant as outlined in 10.622E, and documentation of that account must be submitted for a review. And that's going to be the same whether we calculate it or you calculate it. Sometimes we calculate it and then another month goes by before you make the correction. So you would have to add that to our calculations. You would not just lean on what we sent you with the monitoring report. And sometimes there's too many units or there's too much involved in the issue of noncompliance that we're unable to calculate it or to give you kind of a basis for the calculation. So that would fall on the owner, and then we would review it with the backup. Are there any gross rent or rent and occupancy questions?
Yeah. First thing, because a lot of these questions are very program specific,
right,
with different issues on compliance. So when you ask a question, can you please share with me also your program? Because it's going to change how I answer some of these, or how we, I guess, I'll answer some of these. But we do have some.
Okay.
Okay. Just wanted to finish answering that one.
No worries. I appreciate it.
Okay. So, okay, April, I see that you are tax credit and public housing. So her question is, what if this is tax credit for us, because we cannot answer any question for programs that are not funded by the department. So I can't answer what the answer to public housing is for this. You need to go to your public housing administrator. So what if the household has subsidy? Is it okay at this time to be over max rent if there is subsidy included? So for tax credit, subsidy is not included in the gross rent calculation. So for your tax credit, it is tenant portion of rent plus utility allowance plus any mandatory fee equals gross rent, and gross rent has to be equal to or less than the rent limit. So yes, the subsidy is not included for tax credit. Now remember, for multifamily direct loan, it is included as of right now. Okay, and I think that's, no, I think that is all we have for now. And there is another question that I am going to answer, but it's not on this topic. So.
It's for a little bit later. Okay, then we are going to now talk about recertifications and the noncompliance that's cited under failure to comply with TIN tax section 10.612. For recertifications where you have to perform a full annual income certification, that's going to be cited as failure to provide tenant income certification and documentation. That is also how things are going to be cited under the MFDL programs if a household didn't have 2 months of source documentation or didn't have assets properly verified, that sort of a thing. And for tax credit, this is reportable during the federal compliance period on Form 8823. This is addressed in the 8823 Audit Guide, Chapter 5. But it is also addressed in the TIN tax subchapter F 10.612, where it states that in accordance with Title 10 of the Texas Administrative Code, housing tax credit projects as defined on Part 2, Question 8B of IRS Form 8609 with market units must complete annual income recertifications. Annual recertifications are due within 120 days of the initial effective date of the tenant income certification. An owner may be cited with this non-compliance because the development is required to complete annual income certifications and it was not completed within 120 days of the move-in anniversary, or it was completed after the due date and after the notification of the monitoring review. So this would be cited two different ways. If it was not completed within the 120 days, we would say during the on-site visit or during the monitoring review, the department did not observe an annual recertification for the unit, which occupied the unit on November 13th, 2023. For this example, the annual recertification was due November 13th, 2024. The corrective action is going to be to complete an annual recertification for this household and submit the following documentation to the department: application, verification, certifications, income certification, and first and signatory page of the lease. If it was done late and after the notification of a monitoring review, the non-compliance citation is going to be the same, but the corrective action is going to be that it was done on April 2nd after the monitoring review notification of March 15th, and it is now considered corrected. It is still reportable if you're a housing tax credit development within that federal compliance period. I got an emailed question yesterday. A property was doing an internal audit. They found that a couple of units had missed their recertification. You would want to do that now. So say they were due in January. Well, we're past the 120 days. Go ahead and do it now. It's late, but you're catching it on an internal review. If you're not part of a monitoring review, then that's considered due diligence. But then it's still due in January of 2026. It doesn't reset it to be June now. It still keeps that same date. You're just doing it late, but you're doing it late and catching it up to correct that missed recertification in January. Now, if the property is allowed to do AECs or annual eligibility certifications, or they are not required to complete annual income certifications, it's going to be cited a little bit differently, where it's failure to collect data required by 10.612. This is not reportable. This tells you that annually thereafter, on the anniversary date of the household's original move-in or initial designation, throughout the affordability period, so for the term, owners of housing tax credit developments must collect and maintain current data on each household. That includes the number of households, members, the ages, ethnicity, race, disability status, student status, and rental assistance if there is any. This information can be obtained or can be collected on the department's annual eligibility certification, the income certification, HUD income certification, or USDA rural development income certification form if you have those other programs listed. So the owner may be cited for this if it was not completed at the time of the monitoring review, or it was completed late and after the notification of a monitoring review, or annual data collection is not completed once a calendar year on a post-15 development, or a household transfers from one unit to another within a project and the original date is not used to conduct annual data collection. So if the AEC is not completed on time, then it would state similar to the other noncompliance issue where the household occupied on April 2nd, 2024, most current annual data collection requirements have not been completed. The corrective action is going to be to complete the annual data collection and submit the executed document to the department for review. Do not backdate. That's a trend if y'all haven't caught on to that yet. Do not backdate the forms. So again, if it's completed, but it's after the notification, we're going to say the same basic thing, but we're going to say it was due on February 13th, 2025. It was not completed until April 2nd, 2025, and we notified you of the monitoring review on March 15th, 2025. So this would be corrected, not reportable as of April 2nd, 2025. Now, if you're at a housing tax credit development that has completed the federal compliance period, now you are considered post 15, and I come out to monitoring you now, and I pull a file, and the last AEC was done in 2023, so nothing was done for the calendar year of 2024. It would be cited because you do have to complete these once a calendar year, even for properties with market units. So you can see here the household occupied the unit on February 4th, 2024. That should be 2023 for this example to work. And the most current annual data collection requirements were not completed. The corrective action is to complete the annual data collection and submit the executed document to the department for review. Do not backdate the form. And then it kind of says there the same thing that we just saw, but it's from the monitoring rules for developments which have completed the federal compliance period. So for housing transfers, if a household transfers from one unit to another within a project, then the original move-in date must still be used for annual data collection or annual certification. So if your housing tax credit and your project is defined on 8609B or 8B of 8609, then you would want to be sure that you're using that original move-in date if they're staying in the project. If you are bond only, they can transfer throughout the development and they keep that original move-in date. If you're home, they keep that original certification date. There's some different program requirements for transfers that don't all follow the housing tax credit requirements. So if we come out during the on-site review and realize that they originally occupied the unit February 13th, they transferred August 1st of the following year and did not certify by February 13th of whatever year we're in or of the most recent year, that's going to be cited as non-compliance because it would have been due February 13th. So if you moved them February 13th in 2022, you did an AEC in 2023, then they transferred August 1, 2023, and you missed February 13th, 2024, that would have been an issue. Or if you did it in August of 2024, which was before our notification, we would have ignored that one and now said that that corrected the 24 issue, but now you've got an issue for the 2025 February 13th that was missed. So the corrective action is going to be to complete the annual data collection, do not backdate the form, submit that completed form to the department. And then we usually give you some technical assistance about how transfers work at your specific development, just in an effort to help prevent this from happening in the future. Any questions or anything you want to add on AECs or TIC and DOC?
I do just want to correct. Public housing, when I say public housing, I mean public housing like housing choice vouchers, rental assistance, not your operating funds, because public housing can be operating funds, and then that's different. That's a different gross rent calculation. So just be clear that that's
yes,
different. But no other questions about transfers or AECs.
Annual certifications. Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to get into just some general issues. These are kind of just some that we see. Maybe they're not really these bigger ones that we see, but we just thought these were still important to touch on and give you guys an opportunity to have some resources and get some questions answered. So the first one is an issue of noncompliance with social service requirements. This is not reportable, but it is addressed in Chapter 10.619 of the TINTAC. And we do begin monitoring these with the first monitoring review. If you are any funding source at the department within the last few years, you're probably going to have these, even if you have home funds or National Housing Trust Fund. National Housing Trust Funds. This is something that is now required for all programs in the LURA in a lot of cases. So you want to be sure that you're aware of what's required at your development. This is not just a tax credit and bond requirement anymore. So sometimes this will be cited as the monitor was unable to determine that some or all of the required services were not being offered. We're going to tell you, per Appendix A of the Land Use Restriction Agreement, the development is required to provide supportive services on site. During the monitoring review, the department was unable to identify the required services were being provided, implement the required supportive social services, and submit documentation like flyers, sign-in sheets, etc., evidencing compliance with the LURA to the department for review. We have a very detailed 2-ish hour training on supportive services itself. So if you get cited with this, or you're not sure how to handle this before you get cited with it, we would hope, you should go watch that and really make sure that your supportive services or your social services are in line with what's required so that you can avoid this non-compliance issue. Some of your land use restriction agreements require an additional supportive service point, and that is going to be that you make the development community space available to local nonprofit and governmental providers that would support the health and well-being of your tenants. And you don't have to like lease it to them. In fact, you shouldn't. You just need to send out letters to those agencies. I always use WIC as an example, or food stamps, or the food bank. They can come to your office. They can have folks fill out their forms. They can use your community room as kind of a local base for this purpose. And if you can show us that you're reaching out to these entities, then this is not going to be an issue. And a lot of folks have had good responses, and then we've got a lot of folks that are not able to get somebody to come out. So this is kind of it's similar to affirmative marketing, but it is where you're marketing your space for them to be able to come out so that your tenants don't have to go to the WIC office to fill out the paperwork or go to the food stamp office, that sort of a thing. They can come to your office and do this. This is not a requirement in all LURAs, but it is in some, and it is going to be after your regular supportive services requirements. So we would tell you in the non-compliance that department staff reviewed documentation of supportive services and could not determine that the additional awarded point was being met. You're going to have to provide documentation to the department evidencing that the additional awarded service point has been met. We're probably going to put that first bullet in the technical assistance to keep our non-compliance reports a little bit less wordy because they're a little bit harder to read sometimes. So you want to be sure that you are looking at the technical assistance section of your monitoring report and not just the non-compliance details that are attached to the monitoring report. Are there any questions on social services?
Nope.
All right, so the next one is going to be failure to market to veterans as required in the LURA. This is another, I want to say new, but it's not really that new. It's been 8-ish years since we've been requiring this. This is not reportable on the 8823, but it is something that's required in a lot of land use restriction agreements, and it's going to be as required by the QAP, or the Qualified Allocation Plan, for the allocation year. So if the monitor is unable to determine that the marketing to veterans organizations was being done, or the marketing was done more than a year before the monitoring review, or you tell us, I don't have to do that, this is when it's going to be cited. The land use restriction agreement requires the development owner to specifically market to veterans through direct marketing or contracts with veterans organizations. The documentation submitted for the monitoring review did not contain evidence of the veterans marketing, or it contained evidence that the veterans marketing was conducted more than 12 months prior, that sort of a thing. You would submit documentation evidencing the marketing to veterans organizations has now been conducted. The marketing has to be conducted annually at a minimum. I would not expect there to be questions about that. Okay. So the next one is going to be that the program unit is occupied by non-qualified students. If you are housing tax credit and you're within the federal compliance period, this would be reportable on Form 8823. If you're in the home program, this is considered an ineligible household, or a household over the 80% limit if it's a recertification. This is addressed in the 8823 Audit Guide, Chapter 17, and it's outlined in 10.612 of the 10 tag. If all household members at a housing tax credit unit are full-time students, there must be an exception met for the household to remain eligible. The monitor was unable to establish eligibility because the household's application indicated all household members were currently students. However, no documentation to evidence student status from the institution of higher education was in the tenant file. The annual eligibility certification completed on January 31st, 2025 indicated that the one-person household was currently a full-time student. However, no documentation to evidence student status or the qualifying exemption was displayed in the tenant files. I could actually not find an example for a home property because I think those are easier and harder because it's person by person. But I think the folks that have those programs, that's easy. You guys are doing a bang up job. I could not find an example to use for that one. So that is why there's just housing tax credit, because this is still pretty common for housing tax credit. And sometimes it's as simple as they meet the exception, but they didn't tell us they were married, or you didn't put the tax return to show the minors in the household or claimed by the parent, that sort of a thing. So good job to the MFDL folks who have to do this person by person. The corrective action is going to be to obtain verification of student status for the year that this was impacted, to determine if the household is comprised of a full-time student for at least 5 months of the calendar year, provide the department for review documentations of household student status and any other exemption documentation to evidence eligibility. If unable to verify student status for the 2025 calendar year, for example, the household may be qualified under current circumstances. If a new certification is performed for the existing household, submit the new application, verification of income assets, verification of student status, and qualifying exemption. A new executed income certification would be completed. Or if the household remains ineligible when the unit becomes available, leased to a qualifying household, submit copies of the new household's application, verifications of income and assets, executed income certification form, and first and signatory page of the lease contract, applicable lease addendums, and the executed acknowledgement page of the tenant rights and resources guide. Any questions on student status? Oh, you want to bring that up?
This is a good one. And it does have to do with students. And thank you, April, for putting your program. So for the housing tax credit program, if there is an extended compliance period on the property, but it is post 15. So first let's explain what that means.
Yeah.
So post 15 means that you have completed your first 15 year, or the 15 years of your federal compliance period. So federally, you have to be, for the housing tax credit program, affordable housing for 30 years. The first 15 years are what we call the compliance period. In 10 years, they claim the credits, but 15 years, they have to follow everything in Section 42, plus everything in their land use restriction agreement, plus everything in the Texas Administrative Code. So there's a 3-part thing they have to be in compliance with. After that 15th year is what we call our post 15s. Now you are bound by your land use restriction agreement and still must comply with everything that is in your land use restriction agreement and the Texas Administrative Code, which also encapsulates some parts of Section 42, right? You're not completely. But what is not happening, we do not report noncompliance anymore to the IRS. So that is where the change happens. So there are some Section 42 things you have to follow, but some of them you get to what we call relax. We get to relax some of the more restrictive things in that program. And we have a whole section in the Texas Administrative Code that kind of lets you know what are we still going to monitor for and what are we going to relax. And that's 10.623.
And we have a detailed training
about it too. So what the question here is that this is a post 15, so they've completed that 15 year, but their land use restriction agreement that was issued by the department says that they are going to extend the compliance period, which means during the application process, because housing tax credit, the 9% can be very, very competitive. So an owner will add years to their affordability period in order to make their application more competitive. And so they will either add these years to the compliance period or they will add these years to the end of the affordability period. And this is what we call extended use. So you've got past 30. So the question is, if their Laura says that they have years added to the compliance period, but they've reached the end of the federal 15 period, can the households be considered a full-time student at that point?
Yes, they can. The student rule is relaxed when the federal compliance period ends. If your LURA extends your compliance period, and there are certain things in there like social services, marketing, marketing to veterans is going to be for the whole term, special needs households, a hub or a nonprofit. If that is required through the compliance period, that is still going to be required through that LURA extended compliance period, even though the property's gone post 15. So the relaxations in 623 are going to be allowed, but your LURA requirements for the compliance period are going to continue.
But for the student stuff,
but
so
for student
the
stuff, it would
question
be
is,
relaxed.
can they have a full-time student household? It's a yes and no question. Yes, you can, but your land use restriction agreement, which is a legal document, has some student rules, some student things, verbiage in there. If you read through it, you will see that it has student verbiage in there. So you cannot advertise as student housing. You cannot have more than, I think, 15% of your restricted units leased to full-time students. So it is something that is relaxed, but we're still looking at. So don't just start moving in students once you get to this federal compliance period. Also make sure that you are kind of tracking. I would say flag the files that you know are full-time students. But what is going to happen is if I come out there and pull a sample size and I find one or even two full-time students, may not be that you may not have non-compliance. But if I do drive by your property and you have a giant banner that says now welcoming students, we are probably going to have an issue
non-compliance. And that would be an instance where Amy or I might come out every 6 months to visit you instead of the regularly prescribed timeline. So let's don't do that.
A very long answer for a question, but there was a lot to
There's
play
a lot
there.
of pieces with that. I don't see anything else.
Nope.
All right. So the next kind of lesser issue, but still an issue, is the no evidence or failure to certify material participation of a nonprofit or hub as required by the LURA. This is reportable for housing tax credits if the election was made under a nonprofit set aside, but a nonprofit election that was not on the 8609 or part of a nonprofit set aside is not reportable, and a hub is not reportable. These are outlined in the 8823 Audit Guide, Chapter 22. So if you tell us you have a hub, you don't know what the threshold is for material participation, we're going to reference that 8823 Audit Guide chapter because it's applicable, even though it talks about nonprofits, but the material participation is still what we're going to use as kind of the threshold. This is also outlined in the Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 10, Subchapter F, 10.620. So if there is a nonprofit or historically underutilized business or hub, and the monitor is unable to tell that the hub or nonprofit is in good standing or that it's connected, or that you don't send us the material participation, or you tell us, hey, they just do services. Now, some LURAs require that the hub or nonprofit perform the supportive services or the social services. But that can't be all they do. They still need to be involved in the property operations as a whole. So one reason this might be cited is the LURA throughout the compliance period requires a hub or nonprofit hold an ownership interest in the development. The department was unable to confirm that the hub or nonprofit was part of the ownership structure. So that means we went to the Secretary of State website. We tried to link them to the ownership of the property, and we couldn't link them. We couldn't close that gap or bridge that connection. And that's going to be an issue of noncompliance. And you're going to have to provide documentation like a current partnership agreement to demonstrate the hub or nonprofit is part of the ownership structure. I don't want to see the 10-year-old partnership agreement. I want to see something current in most cases, or that you correct the Secretary of State link that has fallen off. Another reason is that maybe the hub or nonprofit is not, it doesn't evidence that they are maintaining regular, continuous, and substantial participation in the development and operation of the project. If the owner does not provide evidence of how the hub or nonprofit maintains that participation, then it would be cited as noncompliance, and the correction would be that the development needs to submit a statement of how the hub or nonprofit maintains regular, continuous, and substantial participation in the development and operations of the project. Again, that should be current. That should not just be a photo of the hub or nonprofit person standing in front of your property sign. That should be a statement that's dated, that tells what all's going on, maybe what they did in the last year, what the plans are, what they do regularly, that sort of a thing. Because if you send me one and I think, oh, this looks a little old, and I go back to the last review and the review before that, and they're all the same, I'm not really going to be certain that they're still participating, especially if I can't link them. So be sure that you are getting those items updated and submitting current information. The next one is going to be failure to submit all or parts of the annual owner's compliance report. This is reportable if you don't submit Part A and your housing tax credit. This is outlined in the 8823 Audit Guide, Chapter 7, and it's outlined in 10.607 annual reporting rules for or reporting requirements for the in the TINTAC. So if you submitted everything by April 30th, you probably haven't gotten a letter from us. If you did not submit all parts of the AOCR by April 30th, you've probably gotten a letter from us, and it probably had a June 7th corrective action deadline. So if you did get one of those and you're thinking, oh, I didn't pay attention to that, or oh, I did do it, so I'm not in the bunch Kara's talking about, then make sure that that is redone if you have not already done it. And if you did correct it, then good job for you. So the way this would be cited is under that, we would tell you Texas Administrative Code Title 10, Chapter 10 requires that there's an annual owner's compliance report. The report was due by April 30th for the prior year's reporting period. The reason that would have been in the letter that we would have sent out on May 6, 2024, notice of noncompliance for development name, whoever you are, was issued because parts A, B, C, and or the annual owner's financial certification were not submitted by April 30th, 2024. If you have bond, you also have an additional piece to this puzzle. And a finding was assessed for failure to submit all or parts of the annual owner's compliance report. To date, parts of the AOCR and AOCF still have not been submitted. Corrective action was due on June 6, 2024. To correct, submit the missing parts of the report through the compliance monitoring and tracking system. Don't get referred for this, please. The next piece of the requirements in 10.607 are the quarterly reports. And these are due January, April, July, and October on the 10th for the quarter that just ended prior to that. And they have to be submitted. And these should start after leasing activity commences. So if you start lease up right now, you would need to submit that July 10th report to show what happened in the month of June since you've started leasing activity. So if we are monitoring you now and you've been a property forever and you did not submit that April 10th report, it's going to be potentially cited as noncompliance or addressed in the technical assistance, depending on how many of them you have missed. And it would be cited as the development has failed to submit multiple quarterly reports. Submit the most current report, and the department will check the compliance monitoring tracking system to determine compliance. So you would include in your dated letter of corrective action, hey, I submitted it, it's in there. We would verify it, and we would correct the noncompliance as of the submission date. Make sure you have somebody that's on top of this, and for your newer properties, make sure you are checking that those reports are triggered and are scheduled. If they are not, please reach out to CMTS requests so that they can get those triggered for you. And if you're not sure how to do that, it's cmts.requests@tdhca.texas.gov. The next issue is that households' rent was increased more than once during a 12-month period. This is a state requirement, so it's not reportable. You can read the whole statement out of our rule right there. But essentially, if you raise somebody's rent June 1st, you cannot raise it again, even if income limits or utility allowances change until June 1st of the following year, unless they are a housing choice voucher person, or your property is layered with project-based Section 8 or rural development, and the program requires that that rent is adjusted. If you are housing tax credit or you are home, you cannot just willy-nilly change somebody's rent more than once in that 12-month period. And if you're a home development, you can't change it until their lease renewal's up. So this might be cited that during a review, it was determined that the household in the unit had a rent increase more than once in the last 12 months. Rent was increased on 9/1/2024 and then again on February 1st, 2025. Obtain in writing from the household the election to receive a full refund check or have the overpaid amount credited to their household account. In absence of a tenant election, we would expect to see a refund check. Submit the tenant election and appropriate documentation to demonstrate compliance. So you're going to submit to us your calculation of how much was overpaid or what the increase encountered. You're going to put it back to that 9/1/2024 amount because we're still within that 12-month period, and you cannot raise their rent again until 9/1/2025. Another one is going to be that you increase the household's rent more than once. You increase the household's rent $75 or more per month and you fail to issue proper notice. This might also be the case if you have a home development and you raise the rent and you did not give the 30-day notice. So there are some different requirements as far as notifying households. You want to be sure you comply with the state tenant landlord law requirements, but you also have to comply with our program requirements from the TINTAC. And you can see the long words there about the $75 amount. Notice of rent increases are required. Sometimes there's a longer notice that's required. And so if we come out, we might cite this as during the review, it was noted that the household in Unit 123 received a rent increase on 3/1/2025. The increase exceeded $75 and the notice to the tenant of the rent increase was less than 75 days. We're going to tell you to refund or credit the household the $50 that was in excess of the 75 per month from 3/1 to the current date. Owner has to obtain in writing from the household whether they want a credit or a check, and then you've got to submit all the backup and the calculation of the refund or credit to us. Amy, did you have a couple things you wanted to bring up before we wrapped? We've got about 9 minutes.
I've got a couple things that I wanted to bring up, and then we have a question that I wanted to make sure we address. Okay. First of all, I need to apologize to Christina Thompson and Justin Merrill, who are both now on this call. Please feel free to unmute as I'm going through this part and add anything you want to. When Kara was putting this together, I completely forgot to add anything about common findings for the public facility corporations and the 811. So I have made a quick little list here that I'm going to talk about. So if you two want to jump in at any point and say anything about these or disagree or agree with me, please feel free to do that. For our 811 monitoring, some of the most common findings we see out there that we're writing up right now is number one, not meeting your number of units per your RAC, your rental assistance contract. So in your rental assistance contract, there is how many units you have obligated to the 811 PRA program. And if you are not meeting that, that is a finding of noncompliance. It's just like a RAC is just like a land use restriction agreement. If you are not meeting that, you need to demonstrate that you have made good faith efforts to meet that number. And those good faith efforts are going to be stuff like that we would need to see would be a copy of your move out report showing all vacancies, and then the communication between the 811 PRA admin division and yourselves about those vacant units. So how you're supposed to just keep holding them vacant until 811 releases them or until you house an 811 tenant in that unit. And that, so your 811 tenant units, what Justin and I have noticed is they are not fixed units. And once they're not released forever. So basically, for example, if you have to have 7 2-bedrooms dedicated to 811 per your RAC and you only have 5 occupied, and 811 PRA had 5 months ago released a 2-bedroom to you because they didn't have anybody that would meet that occupancy standard on their 811 wait list for your development, that does not mean the next 2-bedroom that becomes vacant is released. It's not released. You need to make sure at the next vacant 2-bedroom, you reach out to 811 again and say, I got a 2-bedroom. Do you have any updates on that wait list? Can I fill it with an 811 tenant? If they say no, they'll release it again. And then the same is if one of those 2-bedrooms that are housed, those 5 people move out, that unit is, again, first you offer it to 811. If they release it, then you can fill it with your tax credit or your market. But you have to offer it till you meet that REC. And then the next thing I think we see is the EIV reports either not being run when the EIV policies and procedures say they are supposed to be run, not being run with a date on them, or what if they are run, no action being taken. For example, one of our biggest ones that we write up is you have to run the income report and you have to settle any discrepancies on the income discrepancy report, and we're not seeing that being completed, and that affects tenant rent. We are also seeing where you're not completing timely or using the correct recertification notices. And this is important because if the recertification is late, we have to make a determination, and so does the owner, on who caused it to be late. Was it staff or was it the tenant? Because that determines when the rent change can happen. Also, the rent being charged on the ledger is not matching the rent that is on the 5/9. And so what is on the 5/9, that is tenant rent, their ledger should match. So charges should match. And remember, 811 tenants cannot be charged fees, period. There's no fees that can be charged to an 811 tenant, except for if they give you a non-sufficient check the second time, not the first time, the second time. So Justin, if there's anything I missed in that little recap, please make sure that you chime in right now and let us know. But I
apologize for that. Yes.
Yeah, but you sent it to me and I did not have anything there.
Yeah, I think they're great, and definitely the top findings we have. I think the most important concept for people to understand is that for the 811 PRA program, unlike our other programs, when we go for our other programs on site, we're taking a snapshot of current circumstances. So if you've corrected things prior to our notice, oftentimes we don't have to cite a finding of noncompliance. But for 811 PRA, just because you're charging the correct rent now, or you're doing the reports now, that doesn't get you out of having to correct previous reports and rents that are not correct. The program, we're looking at a period of scope, and within that scope, we have to ensure that both HUD and the tenants are paying the correct rent. So if you're correctly charging it now, but you can't evidence that you completed a certification for a gross rent change prior to this current annual recertification, we need you to correct that because the correct portions need to be paid.
Thank you, Justin. And then for the public facility corporations, and Christina, after I get through this list, if there's anything else that you want to add, please feel free to jump in. But some of the most common issues in noncompliance that we see in that are the incorrect sample size, the auditor using an incorrect sample size. So there is, in our rule, it talks about exactly what the sample size is required to be, and a lot of times we're not seeing that as the correct sample size. That the PFCs are not verifying income and assets, especially assets. We're seeing that a lot. Matter of fact, we were just told yesterday that please give technical assistance about verifying assets. Now remember, income eligibility is calculated the same way. And so in income determination training, if you go to any of those on how to calculate income and assets, that's the same. The difference is going to be the verification look inside your regulatory agreement, because verification can be different. We are seeing in these regulatory agreements, they're very specific about the verification of income and verification of assets. So please read through that, but you do need to include that as, remember, income from assets is income and it's included. So you need to look at assets to figure out household eligibility. And then the other thing I had, Christina, was overcharging of rents. So please be aware of what your rent limits are. Make sure you're running those for your public facility corporations, and make sure you are charging the correct rents. So Christina, if you have anything to add to that, now would be a good time to add that. And then
I
go ahead, Christina.
thank you. I think those are spot on. Those are the main non-compliance areas that we are seeing. And um, to add, just to add on top of that, the assets, absolutely not verifying assets for income, and not collecting the verification documents that are stipulated in your regulatory agreement. That's another big one. So make sure that you are reading those regulatory agreements and you're collecting that documentation as stipulated in the regulatory agreement, but also calculating the income as per your rule.
Great. And so for the sake of time, Justin, just a heads up, I just assigned a question to you that you can probably just answer in the questions box, because there's just a couple things that I want to do before we break, before we go to open session. So one of them is, Garrett, if you aren't going to be able to be, Manuel's on, so I will see if he can answer that question before we go to open session. And then I just had to talk about, please read your land use restrictions agreements. If you are a newer development, we are starting to now see non-compliance with the continuum of care requirement. So in there, underneath your special needs, you're going to see a continuum of care requirement that requires you to reach out to a continuum of care, or for a homeless service provider, and you have to market to them quarterly. And if you're in lease up, you have to hold units vacant for 12 months. We are seeing this and we are citing non-compliance for this. So because this was about common and this seems to be one that's kind of upticking, please be aware of that and pay attention to that. So now getting to the questions that we have outstanding, we have two, and then we'll take our break for this session. So the first one, Manuel, came in when we were talking about the Inspire section, and it says, if it is noted that a resident has a live pest control issue and we have our exterminator treat, do we send a copy of the report that we had them spray and plan to for time until the pest control is no longer an issue?
Hey, good morning. I guess that question's for me, right?
Yeah.
So let me kind of rephrase the question to make sure I have it correctly. So the property staff is wanting to know, when we cite infestation, how do they respond to that corrective action?
Sounds
And
like
what?
it.
Okay. So um, this is it's kind of a longer kind of an answer. So depending on, first of all, it depends on your score. So if you score 75 and below, then we require you guys to send work orders. So that's going to be an invoice of the licensed pest control company that treated the unit. You don't have to continually send us work orders that verify that it's been treated until it was completed. We just want to know that action was taken. And one work order would suffice. If your development scores 76 and above, then we send an owner certification and a deficiency report spreadsheet and you sign, well, the owner signs that certification verifying that that was taken care of at the property level. Then you add that information to the deficiency report spreadsheet and you submit that. Once you submit that documentation, you don't have to continually submit documentation until that item has been taken care of. We just need to know one time.
Thank you, Manuel. And then the last question that we're going to talk about before we break, and then come back for open session is, this was a really good question. Someone asked, why would we get an event of noncompliance on our monitoring review for failure to provide monitoring and or physical inspection documentation if it was not requested and TDHCA inspects our properties? If it's asked, where is it asked? So I'll answer for compliance monitoring. So for compliance monitoring, we send out a notice of monitoring review. In that notice, it gives you a deadline to submit documentation, and it asks you to submit the unit status report and the monitoring review questionnaire. As you're filling out the monitoring review questionnaire, it's several pages with questions. Each of the questions that you answer yes or no to could be, it will have a trigger that says, if you answered yes, please submit evidence of this requirement in your CMTS attachment system. So for example, if you're required to have supportive services, you're supposed to tell us what services you're doing. And in there, it will say, explain your services and attach them, evidence documenting that you have done this in CMTS attachment system. If you fail to submit your unit status report, if you fail to submit your monitoring review questionnaire, or you fail to submit anything that monitoring review questionnaire requested, then that is how you would get this finding in the compliance monitoring. And I'll let Manuel explain how they would get that finding for physical inspections.
I think, Amy, exactly the same way. We submit a document that's the pre-on-site questionnaire, and in that we require some documents to be submitted. If your development has a elevator, we want to see the elevator certificates, the most current elevator certificate that the development has from TDLR. Those need to be submitted. If your development has a fire protection sprinkler system or fire alarm system that is required to be inspected annually, that is required to be submitted to us. Or if your development has received any local code violations or any type of violations within the last 12 months, that documentation is required to be submitted as well. There's a couple of other questions that we ask as well. If that documentation and that questionnaire is not uploaded to CMTS before we conduct the inspection, then we can cite a finding of noncompliance as well for failure to provide pre-on-site documentation. So it's a very similar process to yours, Amy. So we just require just a little bit different information. Same process.
Okay, I think that's it, Kara.
That's it. But just an FYI, we will not have office hours with a mini webinar in July or August because we are doing Lunch and Learn. So I put the link to register for Lunch and Learn. I apologize for my typing that interfered with Amy's talking about 811. And but that is in the chat if you want to join us for that. Otherwise, we will take a 5-minute break, come back about 11:02 for our open forum. So please stay with us.
And Taryn, I assigned your question to Christina. She'll answer it in the questions box.